There is no one route to terrorism.
To radicalisation.
Yeah, there just isn't.
Is it possible to actually prevent every terrorist attack?
I don't think anyone who's been in charge of counterterrorism policing has ever said we can 100% keep you safe. At the high point of my career, we were dealing with MI5 with over 600 operations.
Did it ever keep you up at night?
I didn't sleep through the night for 7 years.
What's the future of terrorism? How are they changing their act?
I think the big problem now is the threat from foreign states, i.e. Russia, are deliberately picking, proxy idiots to carry out acts and deliberately get caught. But they don't care. They just want to send a message that they're still out there and we're still trying.
Well, we're joined now by the latest addition to the Agents family, if I can put it that way. Andy Hughes, Neil Basu, hosts of the Crime Agents podcast, which is launched this week, which we're going to talk about. But first, let's talk about 2017 and have that reflection on it, because it was an extraordinary year in lots of ways. Politically, I was reporting as a political correspondent at the time for Sky, but it was also an extraordinary year because, it's been called the year of terror, 2017, because there were so many terrorist attacks in Britain in such a relatively short length of time. Neil, how unusual was that?
Well, incredibly unusual. Thanks for inviting us on, Lewis. But you've said there were a lot of attacks. People saw those attacks. Behind the scenes, there were a lot of plots. So the level of extremism, the level of radicalisation and mobilisation towards terrorism was far greater than the public were actually seeing.
Really?
So when an attack gets through, we call it an intelligence failure. It is. We didn't have the intelligence to stop it. And if you think of the context of the times, if you go way back to 2015 when Charlie Hebdo happened in France, we pretty much from that moment, all of Western Europe was preparing for what ISIS was doing in terms of training people and sending them back to their home countries. So we knew we were starting to gear up. Bataclan happened in the November of 2015. We were starting to train more firearms officers, recruit more firearms officers. So in some respects, we were doing the planning and the preparation, but it was still, even for us, Westminster Bridge on that day in March was a massive shock.
Well, let's start with Westminster Bridge. This, of course, was an attempt by a terrorist to penetrate Parliament, one of the most secure sites in the country. Of course, led to the death of PC Keith Palmer. You were in the room at that time, Neil. Just take us into that room. Just tell us exactly about the events of that day.
I wasn't in the operations room, so I wasn't in GT, where you'll have both been in the Metropolitan Police in Lambeth. When the call came in, I was sitting in my office, and my back was to Westminster Bridge. So if you think I was 5 floors up.
It's so close. For people who don't know the geography, it's a 5-minute walk.
Yeah, literally a 5-minute walk from the bridge, 5 floors up, big picture window behind you. I'm sitting with my back to it. You don't hear a thing because it's a well-insulated building for all kinds of reasons. And what happened was I heard Mark Rowley shouting at the other end of the... So Mark Rowley then was the head of counterterrorism. I was his first deputy.
He is now the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
And he's now the commissioner. And when he retired, I took his job. But in 2017, I was the senior national coordinator for counterterrorism operations. So my job was to work with MI5 and stop terrorist attacks. It's a 4-page job description, which I've just crystallised in a sentence for you. And you call 2017 the year of terror. 36 innocent people died on my watch in that year. And I used to think about that every day. I mean, it's 8 years ago. And I've only just started in the last 6 months not to have regular flashbacks to that year. Not just that incident, that year. And when Mark Rowley started shouting at the other end of the office, "Come and listen to this," I sprinted down the office. He had his phone on his office table with a speaker on, and it was our acting commissioner, Craig Mackey, at the time. He was relaying what he was seeing live time, that he'd just seen one of our officers stabbed to death in front of him. And he was relaying that as the terrorist was being shot by close protection officers in the grounds of the Palace of Westminster. As you say, one of the most secure locations in the country had been breached, and if it hadn't been for those close protection officers, well, I don't know what else would have happened.
And Andy, you and I were both working in the same place at that time.
We were.
Because I was a political correspondent at Sky News. You were a crime producer Home Affairs producer at Sky News. I remember that day really vividly myself, because I remember being in Millbank at Sky, and suddenly everyone was just looking out of the window. Yeah. There was just this sort of frisson, this bit of energy went around the room, and it became clear really quickly that something had happened on the estate, which, for people who don't know, it seems weird because we think of the parliamentary estate. Actually, MPs often feel really under threat, but they don't feel threatened on the estate because the estate is so secure. it felt really instantly dangerous. Andy, what were you doing that day?
Well, if I had to describe that day in one word, it would be chaos. And even the reporting around it was absolutely chaotic, because the suspect himself, he actually looked very similar to a very well-known terrorist who was a colleague, a friend of the hate preacher Anjem Choudhury. So instinctively, everyone thought this could be this guy. So obviously you start ringing around, and I spoke to a contact, and pretty early on he said to me, it's not him, it can't be him, the guy you're thinking of, he's in jail. However, every other journalist was thinking that it was still him. And I remember getting a call from the head of home news at Sky saying Channel 4 are lined up with the presenter and they're rehearsing and they're reading out that name. We've got to go with it, Andy. And I said, I'm telling you, it's not him, he's in jail. And they said, make sure. So I rang my contact back and I said, are you sure? And he just said, well, he stopped calling me, he's in jail. And he just hung up. And I thought, well, that's it, he's got to be. So I called the boss back up and I said, listen, if I'm wrong, you can sack me. He said, right, okay, that's enough for me. Channel 4 ended up going with it, and so did pretty much every other news organisation. And for the next hour, I was just sweating, thinking, I've made a massive error here. And then an hour later, Channel 4 came on air, and their correspondent said the guy we've just named has just called in, and he's actually in prison, so we'd like to make an apology.
I'd like to make it clear that counter-terrorism policing knew he was in prison, and I'm waiting.
Well,
for
that
Andy.
is a relief, Neil.
I'm waiting for Andy to disclose who his source was. So,
well, yes, you won't be getting that. But so yeah, it's just that the whole day was just utter chaos, and because this was the first in a long line that year, weirdly we kind of got used to reporting on these massively chaotic events.
And remind listeners who, and it wasn't the gentleman who was in prison. Remind listeners who it was and what he was trying to do.
The guy's name was Khalid Masood, and he did it, and he claimed it was on behalf of the Islamic State. And what he did was he got a car, and he drove along Westminster Bridge, and he just mowed down people. He then kind of pulled over near the palace, and then just ran round with a knife and just directly went up to Keith Palmer, PC Keith Palmer, and he stabbed him. And then he was instantly shot. And then the next thing you see is firearms officers coming in and then trying to save the life of the terrorist.
Yeah, I remember us running up Millbank.
Yeah,
seeing that. A lot of us political correspondents who don't normally cover that sort of thing.
Yeah, and this is the weird thing. You see a police officer trying to save the life of a terrorist. It's a bizarre sight, and people wonder why. But this is their training. The one thing they want to do is actually get him in court. They didn't manage it though.
I remember I was in charge of armed policing when Lee Rigby was murdered, and the CCTV shows armed police officers having had to shoot somebody who was trying to shoot them immediately within seconds, trying to save both their lives. And I thought, wouldn't you want to live in a country where that's the reaction of your police? I mean, there's something incredible about that.
And Neil, you mentioned a few of the other attacks around that time, and of course since, and actually, as you say, the feel of this sort of thing, of a sort of so-called lone wolf taking a car, maybe not even a car, but just approaching a sort of public building or a group of civilians or whatever it happens to be, and trying to just do as much damage as possible. Obviously, this was perhaps more political, involving Islamic State, but what are the commonalities with these people? I mean, how do people, someone like Masood, how do they end up in that position?
Well, it's an incredibly controversial subject you've just opened in a relatively short period of time. Most academics, most professionals in counterterrorism and national security will say there is no one route to terrorism.
To radicalisation.
Yeah, there just isn't. It's often different for everyone, but somewhere in the background there will be a serious grievance. And whether that grievance is something that's happened in your life, have you been marginalised? And when we're talking about the greatest volume of threat, it was Islamist jihadism. So foreign policy, foreign wars, the way the Muslim community was being treated here were all used as excuses by people to be, and excellent tool, material for radicalisers who want to radicalise young people. And now this particular terrorist at Westminster Bridge wasn't a young person and hadn't been known to the security services, hadn't come across the radar since 2009. So he was sort of 8 years out of the game. But for 8 years he had been gestating. His grievance had been developing along that time. And one of the things he'd done was he'd been out to Saudi Arabia. We knew that. He'd been out there to teach. And although he didn't formally declare that this was on behalf of the Islamic State.
Oh, they claimed it, didn't they?
Yeah, they claimed it, and
Yeah.
that became a very common
Yeah.
thing for ISIS to do, because anything that looked like a success they wanted to claim, even though they hadn't sanctioned it. They weren't like Al Qaeda. In the Al Qaeda days, an emir had to sanction an attack. There was a covenant that said you don't attack where you live. ISIS changed all of that. Said we don't care about that. We don't even need you to come here and be trained. Just attack anyone where you live with any method you like. And it doesn't matter. And that's what changed the methodology and typology of terrorism. And in that year, we did have people cooperating together, but the fundamental line is they had been seduced by this Salafist, Islamist, jihadist rhetoric that there was a war against the West, and the West hates Muslims. And
You've got to
therefore you
remember
must
the
attack.
propaganda as well.
Yeah, it was
Their
Hollywood
propaganda,
style, yeah.
it was kind of, I mean, it was produced to an unbelievable standard, and they were just pumping these messages and videos out, and they were making a real impact. And it shocked the world. And before that, we were watching these terrible beheading videos and these videos of Jordanian pilots being set alight, produced to a Hollywood standard. But this was the first time that it played out on our streets.
It's a bit of a weird. It must be a weird thing to wrestle with in a way, Neil, because you mentioned all of the people who died in just that year. But if a police officer dies, Palmer died, does that hit the police force differently internally?
Oh yeah, I mean there are people today who are utterly broken by their experience. I remember I was telling
Even
Andy
today, of Palmer's death.
Oh yeah, I was telling Andy back in 2021, in my final year in the job as the head of CT, one of his best friends who'd held his hand as he died sat in my office, a glass-fronted office with our backs to the open plan office behind us, and he had been holding Keith's hand when he died, and he reached out and held my hand, and he didn't let go for 20 minutes, and he was crying his eyes out. You know, you're talking about an officer with 30 years experience who's been off for the last 2 years, having a nervous breakdown, coming back to work, effectively being just about able to get through a day, and then medically retiring. And it was the time in the Met where we realised our occupational health, our medical, our welfare of officers had to step up, because everyone was affected by that.
Of course, as you say, in short order, there were multiple other attacks, and in particular, I suppose of that year, the one that lives in the public memory most viscerally is the Manchester Arena attack. Not least because of the death toll, which was horrific, but obviously because so many of the dead were children, and it was a concert which so many young people and children were attending, and the means of doing so, the sorts of bombs that were involved, explosives that they had, were so barbaric, and the injuries that people had. It moved the entire country. Again, it happened in the general election campaign, just as the London Bridge attack, which followed it, did as well. You mentioned the guilt that you feel, Neil. I would imagine a lot of people involved, seeing those pictures and experiencing what happened afterwards, they must still feel a lot of guilt, rightly or wrongly, to this day.
I was with a company this morning lecturing on Martin's Law, which was developed because of Manchester Arena, which is a protection of premises to get event organisers and business owners to put counter-terrorism measures in place because of the disaster that happened. And the disaster wasn't just there, it was obviously in the operational response, it was in the intelligence that led up to the attack. Everyone from me, Ken, the current head of MI5, we were close friends. He was the deputy at MI5, I was the deputy in counter-terrorism policing. Everyone from the top of the organisation to the bottom, our most junior staff were deeply affected by all of the attacks that year, but that one was particularly visceral. And the first slide that my colleague put up this morning was the faces of the 22 murdered. But as we remind people, over 1,000 people were physically and psychologically injured on that day, some of them maimed, terrible, life-changing injuries. And we sometimes forget about those because 22 people were murdered. But the psyche on Manchester, people had travelled far and wide, so there are other towns deeply affected by this. The age, looking at that photograph of the murder victims is one of the hardest things that will ever happen. I remember walking into the major incident room in Manchester, and the brilliant Simon Barraclough, who was the senior investigating officer who brought Hashim Abedi to justice, he had put pictures of all of the victims around the incident room so that everybody who walked into the incident room every day would understand what they were doing and why, while we were trying to hunt the cell, if you like, that we thought had organised this. And I remember him saying, Amber, who was Home Secretary at the time, Amber Rudd, I know she walked into that room and she had the same reaction as me. It was impossible not to cry.
How did you mentioned the fact that these things are failures? I mean, they're obviously failures. They're security failures. Is it possible to actually prevent every terrorist attack?
No, and I don't think in the entire history of the security services in this country, so MI5's been around since 1904, they actually took over responsibility for counter domestic threats, domestic terrorism threat, and what was then the Fenian and the IRA plots as it became in the Troubles from New Scotland Yard in that year. They took primacy for it. I don't think anyone who's been in charge of that organisation or has been in charge of counter-terrorism policing has ever said, we can 100% keep you safe. And if I describe the kind of measures that would be required in a country to keep you 100%, I'm 100% certain you wouldn't want to live there.
No one's got any further thoughts for journalists, Andy.
No.
Rightly so. But nonetheless, reporting on these things is difficult, isn't it? I mean, I found that myself. You've done it more than I have in terms of sort of crime-related stuff, but I've reported on plenty of terrorist stuff. I mean, I'll never forget Joe Cox's murder, which obviously occurred the year before. These things sort of stay with you. What do you remember from that time?
They do. I mean, it's in a way it kind of seems ludicrous us talking about our experiences when you hear Neil's story, but we knew there was a problem in Manchester because we were actually investigating a jihadi cell at that time, at the time of the bombing, and we got some documents leaked to us by a defector of the Islamic State who slipped Sky News a USB stick, and on that stick was thousands and thousands of documents, which were effectively application forms to join ISIS.
Wow.
So we got these translated.
They do application forms.
They literally do an application form.
Like
what job would you like to do? Sniper? Gunman? What would you like?
What's your experience?
Yeah, exactly. What's your experience? So we had all these documents. Obviously, it was kind of all around the world, but we got someone, a data journalist, to put all this information together and then find out where all these people who were joining ISIS were from. And what we found was there was a real big concentrated cluster in the Moss Side, Fairfield area of Manchester. So myself and a team went there, and we spent about 6 months there investigating, and it was kind of old school journalism. We were doing it by just knocking on neighbours' doors, speaking to the local mosque, speaking to the community centres, just gathering a picture of who these people were. And then when the bomb went off, me and my team just looked at each other and said, he's got to be one of the people we're looking at. And it was.
Chill must have gone down your spine.
Oh my God, it was. So Salman Abedi was part of this terror cell that we were looking into in Manchester. There was a group of about 8 of them, all from the same estate. They used to go to the same mosque. So 24 hours after the attack, we put the whole story out there. And we had, people from the security services calling us saying, how on earth have you got all this information so quickly? But we had it because we were investigating them for 6 months.
And I think it's right to say that policing at the time did not have a handle on the Libyan diaspora in Mossad.
Exactly.
But if you had that, Andy,
yeah,
did the police have that?
No.
And if not, why not?
Well, they did after, because we gave it to them after that.
But there was this came out in the inquiry, but there was a complacency around. If you think about the backdrop, the geopolitics behind this, the LFG were originally an anti-Gaddafi force fighting to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, and the LFG were considered to be a bit the same as when the Taliban were fighting the Russians.
A tough question, Andy. I mean, and I understand the dilemmas you'd have had with this as a journalist. But afterwards, did you ever regret not handing some of this stuff over before?
That is a tough question. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest, Lewis. It's something I try not to think about. The facts are, we don't usually, journalists don't routinely let the authorities know what we're doing.
Of course.
We, in a way, presumed that they already had this information. It was a shock to me when I got the phone call saying, how on earth did you have all this information? I was shocked that they didn't have it. So we handed over that information, and in fact one person was arrested and later jailed for that, because he was named on there.
Here's a question I thought about a lot, particularly I thought about it a lot at the time, which is that a lot of these events, as we're talking about, and they took place during the period of a general election campaign, particularly the London Bridge attack and the Manchester Arena attack, that always felt unusual and weird. Is it unusual and weird? Actually, is the premium for terrorism, does it go up during a general election campaign? Is it something that you think about, that you're more, when you're working in counterterrorism, you think that there's greater probability of terrorism during a political period, a general election campaign, a referendum campaign, as we saw with Joe Cox's murder?
I mean, there are a huge number of factors that go into the independent body, the Joint Terrorism Assessment Centre, who are an independent body of government and the police. It is staffed by police and security agencies staff, but they are independently looking at all the intelligence that comes in, and then they are overlaying that with all major events. So yes, a general election campaign will be one of the factors leading to that. And of course, remember what terrorism is about. Terrorism is about wielding political influence and preferably overthrowing the politics of the time. So in an election, remember the Madrid bombing that toppled the Spanish government?
2004,
yeah. So, that's what it's for. So yes, you're right to ask yourself the question. There is a clear understanding by JTAT that will be one of the variables they'll be putting before National Security Cabinet.
And what are the main reasons? I mean, maybe actually there are just loads and there's never a sort of single group. But are there sort of common reasons or factors as to why counter-terrorism fails? As in, why some plots, many plots, you've already said, Neil, are foiled. We never even hear about them, which is something I think about all the time. And I think anybody who thinks about it finds it really disturbing. Yeah. But some do slip through the net and some happen. Why does some succeed and some fail?
There's a volume issue. So there's 43 late-stage plots since 2017, since this terrible year.
And what would late stage mean?
It means somebody is about to attack
and
murder somebody. Yeah. So the intervention takes place because MI5 have developed intelligence to a point where they've said, alongside counter-terrorism policing, we do probably more human intelligence than even MI5 do, but they do a lot in terms of electronic digital SIGINT, as it's called, as I know you're aware. When they've got an intelligence picture that says this looks like it's going to explode into an actual plot, obviously we're not going to let it go any further. That's when police take over, and people who now do my job. We had Richard Smith on the crime agents recently. That was the job I was doing in 2017. We take over the operation and we decide when to go in and arrest. And there were 29 on my watch, and there's now been a total of 43 since 2017. So you're right. But by the way, we don't think of them either. I mean, it's not like a Kingsman wall saying, look at all the plots we foiled. No one has time to think about them. You're just going on to the next plot. So I'll say some figures I'll say them because they were made very public, because Ben Wallace, who I love, by the way, but he was security minister at the time, and he inadvertently gave away figures that we wouldn't ordinarily have talked about.
Remember that.
But he talked about 3,000 subjects of interest, active subjects of interest, terrorists that we are trying to ensure are not mobilising towards an attack. 20,000 closed subjects of interest, so people who have been of interest to us in the past and have either been found not to be radicalised or not considered an immediate or current or even future threat, so they've been closed. And probably at the high point of my career, we were dealing with MI5 with over 600 operations. And he unfortunately has been as high as 800. So some of those are not joint operations, some of those are just the police dealing with them, some of them are just intelligence.
600 potential threats that you're looking
600 potential operations there. And don't get me wrong, we're a well-resourced organisation, the counter-terrorism machine in this country, and it's a brilliantly collaborative one. It's not like you saw 9/11. The 9/11 Commission, if anyone reads that, was a whole load of disparate agencies who never spoke to each other and didn't even like each other, not sharing intelligence, not sharing information. That is not the UK counter-terrorism machine. It's admired worldwide because we do speak to each other. And now we set up a massive operations, a 32-storey building in West London where people collaborate every day in the same office space. That's a brilliant thing, but that's the volume. And the volume is very hard. and you're looking at tiny fragments of intelligence. Andrew Parker was brilliant when he was in charge. He describes as tiny pinpricks of light, in this canvas, and you're trying to join those dots up, and it is incredibly difficult to do. It's not like we're not Google, it's ironic.
So how do you foil it? What are the reasons that they don't succeed? What happens to make sure that you do your job successfully?
They're not very good at tradecraft, so they're not very good at disguising who they are, where they are, and what they're doing.
They're bad terrorists.
They're bad terrorists. They speak to the wrong people, sometimes our people.
There is an undercover element, an intelligence element, a strong intelligence element.
I said this on our first episode of the Crime Agents. If you want to understand what counterterrorism policing and the security services do, it's not hidden. Almost every Hollywood film or TV drama that you've seen about policing or the security service will include an element of how we catch terrorists.
Which is?
But you can get a combination of physical surveillance, electronic surveillance, cyber surveillance, and human intelligence. So in other words, somebody's either going to tell us or we're going to pick up a footprint of it somewhere electronically. It's when we don't get any of that. So in other words, it isn't. We're not horrified. I still say we. I've got to stop doing that. I'm retired. We're not horrified when we're shocked and we're mobilised and we're professional and we're trying to solve a plot. But when somebody we don't know comes out of the blue and is not in any of our systems and has never come across our radar, as people started saying, not on our radar, that in some respects is easier because they've managed to evade all detection. What's really horrible, and we're going to go on and talk about Borough Market, was the ringleader of Borough Market was an active subject of an active investigation and still managed to plan and deliver and execute a murderous plot, even though he was an active terrorist under investigation. That is horrific. For all of us who are professionals, that is horrific. Somebody coming out of the blue, particularly these days, might be a kid, might be somebody like the Streatham High Road attacker in 2020 who literally walked down a street, grabbed a knife off a kiosk shelf and started stabbing people. I mean, luckily we were literally following him at the time and he was shot dead before he could murder anyone. But, it was that close. I mean, the ability to commit an atrocity without telling anyone, without showing out that you're about to do something, is the most difficult thing to stop.
We should talk about the crime agents, which we'll do more in a minute. But before we do, I've always had one question that's always rattled around my head, and the two of you will be able to answer it, is that given everything you've said, Neil, and given what we see in other countries as well, which have actually had less success, perhaps than our own security services, in foiling terrorist plots, why aren't there more of them? Is it because, and I've always never been able to quite decide, and I'm not sure which answer I prefer, is it because actually the authorities slightly exaggerate for political or security reasons actually how grave the threat is? Or is it that actually it's really, really grave, and actually it's graver than we realise, it's just that our security services are very good at what they do?
I think probably the latter, I would say.
Well,
do you agree?
I would say definitely the latter. When I came into counterterrorism,
I suppose I'm asking the wrong man with that.
Yes. What am I going to say to that? I mean, the point is we are a very effective professional machine that deals with an enormous volume, which in some respects should scare the public. And I've always said part of my responsibility was to reassure the public, not scare them. But you have to keep them alert, because what you've just said about if you can't see it, we figured out in 2017 when we reviewed all of our processes, we were not sharing the intelligence we had outside of the top secret community. And you've made a very good point about Andy. Andy didn't have confidence to go. He either thought we had it, or many journalists would not have the confidence or the trust in the police to hand over their material.
You don't even think about it.
No, but doctors don't either, teachers don't either, social workers don't either. And we realised we were not sharing information with the very people. In other words, that terrorist isn't in a national database, but they might be in a doctor's report or a social worker file.
So did you get better after 17? And that's one of the reasons that we've had terrorist attacks since, but not at the pace and number that we did in that period.
Yeah, we got much better at joining the dots, analysing the data. We got much better at sharing the data outside of the security machine, so we get a fuller picture of what was happening. The collaboration is there.
I was going to say there was a lot of well, there was a big problem with collaboration in the MI5 and the Counter-Terror Police and GCHQ, and now they work much closer.
If you go back to 7/7, and we are in the 20th anniversary year of that, so there's an awful lot being talked about that now, but 7/7 was the big wake-up call in this country, almost a sort of 9/11 for the UK, about how agencies needed to work together. I mean, the suicide tactic was new, the scale of destruction was new, the fact that they were homegrown terrorists was new, the fact that it wasn't, the plot didn't originate in London. You know, we thought all terrorism was, that's why New Scotland Yard's been in charge of it for so long. It was always the top RA target, it was always 70% of the threat. We suddenly realised none of that was true, so the counter-terrorism policing network you've got today began in earnest in 2005 and has been developing for 20 years into what it is today, which I would say, of course I would say this, there's a bit of, I don't know, there's maybe a bit of justification, but at the end of the day, it is admired worldwide for what it is, but it's not foolproof.
Did it ever keep you up at night?
I didn't sleep through the night for 7 years until 6 months after I retired in 2022.
We'll be back with more from Andy and Neil to hear about their new podcast, The Crime Agents, just after this. Right, we're going to talk about crime agents, but I just have one other question about terrorism, because it does seem germane. We've talked quite a bit about the past. We should talk about the future briefly, which is how terrorism's changing. Neil, I mean, you and Andy, you both talked about how the UK has changed, how the security services have changed, the state has changed, but the face of terrorism is changing as well, isn't it? I mean, particularly with technology. I mean, I was at a briefing the other day with someone who was talking about staying up at night or keeping them up at night. Neil's talking about, for example, the potential of drone technology, and which we've seen transform warfare. But these things easily get into the hands of non-state actors, and the potential for mass casualty events using drones, technology, cyber, and so on. What's the future of terrorism? How are they changing their act?
I think the big problem now is the threat from foreign states. When Neil was doing his job, I mean, I might be putting words in your mouth, but I imagine that was
I'll let you know.
a small part of your work. Now it's a huge part. You just have to look at the number of
Well, we thought
arrests.
we thought state threat had largely. I mean, go back to the 7/7 period. You were talking about, Neil. It was all talking about non-state actors, terrorist groups. That was the future of the security threats to the UK, and now it's all about states again.
Exactly, and it is. And you just have to look at the amount of arrests that have taken place in the past couple of months. And there's a couple of high-profile cases. I'm sure you know which ones I'm talking about. That counter-terrorism policing are doing. So they
that are connected with states.
Yes, connected with states. Yes,
People in the employ of foreign aggressive,
proxies,
hostile governments.
Just you just, and then there was a trial. There was 6 Bulgarians were found guilty of spying for Russia. That was just at the end of May.
And they were embarrassingly amateurs.
This
thing about using
that was a
proxies,
shambles.
Using proxies is how states are trying to distance themselves from what they're actually trying to achieve. But this all started at pace, sort of midway through 2023. And I have to admit, I was sitting there, 6 months retired, looking at this stuff taking off, thinking this wasn't part of my workload. So my poor successor, Matt Jukes, was dealing with this, but it's not like terrorism had gone away. And it was the biggest concern when I left the job was the government was starting to, we brought the National Security Act in, we lobbied for that, we needed more stronger powers against state threat. But the biggest thing was they were thinking, well, you can pivot all the resources you successfully used to break Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and the threat to this country, you can use all that on hostile state. We haven't broken that threat. You might have broken an organisation, but the ideas are still there and the people are still being radicalised online. So you're going to have to fund both the terrorism threat and you're going to have to rebuild a state apparatus that you last had at the height of the Cold War. You're going to have to rebuild that.
So you're saying that in the immediate period, we're potentially looking at the same sort of non-state actor threat that we've been looking at for the last 10 to 20 years. And it's easy to see how that could become inflamed again by current events, Iran,
It's
and
very
everything
easy
that's
to
going
see
on
that,
there.
yeah.
Exactly that.
And yet, as well, and this is where the geopolitics really fuses with it, actually a heightened threat from foreign states that is a very different sort of beast to deal with if you're in counter-terrorism.
And you're right, and the Venn diagram of those of those two things has been complicated by the use of proxies and the use of and the worst, the mechanisms change. So the thing that fundamentally changed the threat to all of us is the mechanism by which people are radicalised or by which conspiracy or disinformation is spread. So social media, humankind's greatest invention, I always say, has become its greatest curse, because in the hands of the bad guys, that has become, particularly the ones who are, they're almost as good as our producers here. They're capable of putting out propaganda at volume, which is incredibly impressive, disturbing, affecting, and it's radicalising people in days.
Or just simple
days.
lies, as we've seen
Oh,
in
they're,
Southport
they're,
and
they're
elsewhere.
mostly lies.
I think one thing, I spoke to a source in Counterterrorism, and he said something quite astonishing to me that I couldn't quite believe, which was he thinks that i.e. Russia, are deliberately picking, proxy idiots to carry out acts and deliberately get caught. So it's like they know that they're sending them into the den to get caught, but they don't care. They just want to send a message that they're still out there and we're still trying. And who knows what the actual plan is.
And don't forget, I'll quote Jeremy Fleming, a friend of mine who used to run GCHQ, and like me he's probably ranting at this broadcast when it goes out, saying he's got that wrong. But he was asked.
We get that all the time. The key is not to listen.
He was specifically asked, "What do you think is the greatest threat facing this country?" And we were all worried at the time that somebody was going to flick a switch and turn off a nuclear power station. He said, "That's not the greatest threat. The greatest threat is disinformation, polarising society. We're already polarised. The amount of effort hostile states are putting into putting absolute crap out on the airwaves, trying to divide politics, trying to divide people against each other. The bots that are used to amplify things like Southport, if you look at the amount of stuff that was delivered, remotely, autonomously by state actors. We first saw that, and we talked about Westminster Bridge. There's a woman walking over Westminster Bridge, Muslim woman with a hijab on, and she's on the phone, and that went viral as, look, these people just don't care. She's walking past dead people. She was hysterical on the phone to our control room, calling it in. But that's not the message that went viral, because state-sponsored bots turned her into,
a sympathiser, terrorist sympathiser.
A terrorist sympathiser. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
That one, yeah.
And of course, how many people will have seen the clarification on that versus the number
exactly.
of people
Once it's out there,
yeah,
it's out there.
Well, that's it.
It sounds like, fellas, there's plenty to talk about for you on the crime agents.
There is, yeah. We've got our hands full.
Well, we're hoping not to.
For those watching, we've just had a bit of a scene change.
That's
here.
a lot better, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, you've redecorated. I don't like
I thought I'd had a stroke.
It'll come after
I'm
working
of
with
that
Andy for a
age.
few years, Neil. No, we've just, for those listening, we've just got the crime agents branding all around the studio here. I feel I'm going to be kicked out at any moment. Just tell us a little bit about the premise of the show. What's the point of it? What are you trying to do?
There's a real thirst out there for major crime stories, and there's not a lot of information. And the idea behind this podcast is to inform the public about what's going on as it's happening, not a 3-minute news report, a 40-minute podcast or more. And we're going to be doing bonus episodes, we're going to be taking questions. But one of the differences that we wanted to make is that investigative journalism will be at the heart of this podcast, as we've shown in our first episode. Yes, you're still going to get the expert analysis and opinion of two people who, between us, have got 50 years experience. But also, we want to be exposing stories and criminality and individuals. And what we want to do is take the audience on that journey with us.
And Neil, I suppose the point as well is, Andy's just alluded to it, and people will have already got this sense from the conversation we've had, the sort of depth of both of your expertise and knowledge for sure. But it is crime journalism and crime reporting and talking about crime is a really interesting one, because as Andy says, there is huge interest in it. But very often it is a sort of, they're like sort of ships going along on the horizon. They sort of come, they sort of go. And as opposed to, say, politics or economics or even sport journalism, where there's a huge amount of analysis around it, very often that, at least to me, is a very high, I think people can tell, high news user or consumer, is very often not there. So the point of the show is to try and add greater depth as to what is going on the inside, the things that we don't see. Is that right?
Yeah, I was incredibly excited when Andy rang me up and he said somebody, sitting not too far away from me, has had a brilliant idea and thinks that there is a market for this.
Genius, I hear.
And we should probably be calling you Daddy now, but Mark Russ has ruined that for me. He really has.
Your granddaddy, Neil.
But I was watching, bear in mind I've been sitting at home for 2.5 years listening to people pontificate on crime stories with the reputation of policing, and the trust and confidence in policing collapsing, and nobody analysing the stories in any kind of depth, often getting the wrong end of the message, and it's incredibly frustrating. And you want somebody to take those issues, and I'm an avid newsreader as well. So when I listen to podcasts which actually try and deconstruct what's happening in our world, either economically or politically, I'm beginning to understand what that news headline was. Nobody does that in crime. There's a news headline, scares the living daylights out of everyone. Somebody says something for 6 seconds and then you move on to the next crime that's reported the next day. And I was getting very frustrated by that. And I thought this might be an opportunity to actually, as you say, get behind the actual story about what's actually happening. And you know what?
Lift the curtain, as we say.
And go behind the
Peek
badge
behind
and
the
see the
curtain.
humanity of the people who in police and the criminal justice system and national security who have to do these jobs on our behalf.
First couple of episodes already out.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So the
People can go
first.
and listen now.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be doing it every Wednesday, but our first episode is catching a terrorist or hunting one down at least.
Yeah.
So we, I say we, I went to Moss Side against the advice of my esteemed co-host.
Well,
of
I
course.
suspect that the former police officer doesn't particularly encourage vigilantism.
No.
I would imagine.
No.
I also, when people watch the video, want him to stop sounding like a 1970s Life on Mars copper. If he says clocked us one more time,
Yeah.
Hello,
people
hello.
will think that that's how we talk.
Yeah.
Well, look, the first 2 episodes are absolutely brilliant. People should go and listen now. Gents, been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks
you,
for having
Lewis.
us on, Lewis.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.